Cowboy Bebop is one of the greatest TV shows of all time. Since its release in 1998, the show has garnered almost universal praise from around the world. Critics and fans alike cite the animation, world building, characters, storytelling, soundtrack, and melding of genres as the primary reasons for its success. It has stood the test of time, and more than 20 years later, it's still considered by many to be the greatest anime in history. When I watched it for the first time sometime during the endless void that was 2020, I was initially skeptical. I was not much of an anime fan, nor did I think a show with such a stunning reputation could possibly live up to the hype. However, as the series progressed, I understood what was so loved about the show. Every single bit of praise that I'd ever heard for it was 100% correct. To this day, it remains the only anime I've ever watched start to finish, partially thanks to the fact that it's only 26 episodes long. So, when Netflix announced that it was adapting this genuine masterpiece, I was skeptical too. I'd seen how people reacted to the likes of Death Note and original Netflix anime like Neo Yokio.
You don't deserve this big Toblerone.
Then, just a few months before it was set to release, Netflix released the intro sequence to their YouTube page. This managed to change my expectations a little. I thought the iconic intro was given a nice facelift that looked great until the live action bits. I also didn't really have many issues with the cast, but I wondered if a much older Harold Lee was up to the task of portraying one of the most legendary characters in all of anime. Shortly after, we got our first glimpse of the cast in action with The Lost Session. It's a quickly edited teaser that clearly had effort put into it. All of that effort may have been concentrated on trying to be Scott Pilgrim, but at least it was there. With these two pieces of promotion, I thought perhaps they could by some miracle not screw this up. I thought the dialogue was pretty terrible and the editing needed work, but the cast seemed capable and the action wasn't awful. I thought there maybe was a chance of things actually being pretty okay.
You serious?
The New York Times said this adaptation was the original but without all the art, that it was unfair to compare to the source material, but there was no reason to discuss it if you're not doing that. This is a harsh condemnation, but it's entirely deserved. It's not only bad, it's a straight-up insult to the original. So, what went wrong? Why was I so angered by this show I should have known would be awful? Obviously, it's because I'm a big fan of the original, but there's a lot more to it than that. Here's my semi-coherent attempt to unpack why it failed so hard. From here on out, there will be discussion of spoilers, both for the original anime and the remake. Consider this your official warning. Also, this is my opinion. I feel very passionately about this topic, but there's no reason to spread hate to anyone who likes the live-action version, nor am I encouraging any hate for those who disagree with you. I simply want to discuss why I had issues with the show. The original Cowboy Bebop was a show unlike anything in its medium. First-time showrunner Shinichiro Watanabe was given total creative freedom to make whatever he wanted, and the end result was an action-packed space western noir with character-driven focus, but also heavy on laughs. It incorporates elements from so many styles and genres that it necessitated an episodic structure with little connective tissue. He let each episode have its own room to breathe and tell its own story, to flow freely like jazz. Essentially, each episode is treated like its own mini-movie with a beginning, middle, and end. There are, of course, connections between the episodes and an overall plot, but it's more focused on the concept of how little moments impact our characters. The average session is a day in the life of a space cowboy, completely content with enjoying the present for what it is, not what it could mean in the large scale. This is in stark contrast to the characters themselves, who were specifically created to be flawed and unfit for life in normal society. Spike Spiegel, the main protagonist, is an ex-member of organized crime, who, despite surviving an ambush during his attempted escape, acts like he's a dead man walking. He was forced away from the only person he ever loved, Julia, and hides that behind a smooth persona. Next is Jet Black, Spike's bounty hunting partner. He's an ex-cop who lost his arm in the line of duty. He buried everything from his past and tried too hard to move on, but can't quite let go of the relationship he shared with his ex-wife, or his glory days as an officer of the law. Faye Valentine seems to be your average femme fatale, carelessly charming anyone to get what she wants. But eventually we learn she's an amnesiac who can't remember anything from the time before she was put in cryosleep. She dons this persona while desperately and recklessly searching for who she is by trying to find out who she was. Radical Edward is an eccentric hacker who wants nothing more than a family to replace the one that orphaned them. Lastly, Ein the dog is a corgi, a once highly sought after breed of dog that is now no better than the lowly mutt. Unbeknownst to the crew, Ein was experimented on and possesses unusually high intelligence and abilities a dog does not normally have. Together, this ragtag team of outcasts makes up the crew of Bebop, an old, beat-up spaceship. They fly around the solar system getting into trouble in pursuit of their next payday. The major themes of Cowboy Bebop are that of loneliness, existentialism, boredom with life, and an inability to let go of your past. The tragedy of Spike Spiegel is told slowly over the course of the show's run. It starts with him being nothing more than a reckless hothead who holds little regard for his own life, but as time progresses, little cracks in his indifference in the world start to form. While searching for something, anything to make him feel alive again, Spike finds himself drawn to his past. He dwells on the time he spent with Julia and his friendship with his old partner in crime, Vicious. All the while, he builds a new life and family with the crew of Bebop. Despite having a new place in the world and a family who cares about him, Spike doesn't see the point in staying alive anymore. He barely escapes death in his first confrontation with Vicious, only to make him more obsessed with his past. The audience is only shown brief flashbacks that are very minimalist. This is the show attempting to pull Spike out of his past and into the wonderful present he's built for himself. This all culminates when Vicious successfully kills Julia, Spike's last reason for being alive. Faye urges him not to confront Vicious, but Spike is too determined.
You told me once to forget the past, because it doesn't matter. But you're the one still tied to the past, Spike. What are you going to do? Just throw your life away like it was nothing?
I'm not going there to die. I'm going to find out if I'm really alive.
In the inevitable confrontation, Spike manages to kill Vicious, but not without being mortally wounded himself. He collapses onto the stairs, which is the last that is ever heard from him. Does he live? Does he die? No one knows for sure except Watanabe, who refuses to take a stance. His fate is ambiguous, and I think that only adds to the emotion. It's a horrible tragedy, and one of the most intensely emotional conclusions to a series I've ever seen. The final message is, you're gonna carry that weight. This quote challenges our understanding and perception of time. It is of course a reference to the 2016 smash hit film Sing from Illumination Studios. Of course, it's actually a reference to the last album the Beatles ever recorded, Abbey Road. Carry That Weight specifically was about how each of the band members' individual accomplishments would never amount to what they did together as a group, and when they all leave to start their own solo careers, each of them will have to carry the weight of being a member of the Beatles with them. But what does this message say about Bebop? About Spike? There were a couple interpretations that I like. First, you're gonna carry that weight is a message to the crew of Bebop. They're all forced to carry the past on their shoulders, but some manage to keep it buried, others find what they're looking for and realize none of it matters, and still others are going searching for their new place in life. But for Spike, he carried his weight into the grave. And that's where it will always lead you if you're not careful. Another interpretation of this is that the message is directed at us, the viewers. Now that we've seen the tragedy of Spike's final adventures, we have to carry the weight of his decisions. Now that Spike can't carry his past, it's up to us to remember it and do it for him. Will we learn from the mistakes of Spike and let go of our own past? I really like both of these interpretations, and it's not impossible for both of them to be true at the same time. It's a note that kept me thinking about the series for a long time. Now that I've given a bit of context, let's see how Netflix addresses these themes. Oh. Before tearing into this show, let's discuss the good things about it. I think for the way the show is, the cast is pretty solid overall. Ein is a particular standout. I think they really nailed that casting choice. Jet is another standout, and John Cho is a good actor, but kind of a weird choice for Spike. The intro sequence switching which words are in English and Japanese is a pretty cool way to mirror the original, while signifying that this is different. The action is also pretty creative at times, using environments in a fun way. It's not super well shot, but the concepts are there in the first few episodes. The action gets noticeably worse over the course of the show and results in cheap gunfights or boring hand-to-hand fights, but it starts off really strong. I also enjoy the fact that the cast and world are more diverse. It feels good to see an expansion of the show's focus on diversity. That goes for all types in the show. If anything, I would have liked a deeper exploration. Obviously, the show was always going to be conceptually weaker than the original. Rather than a visionary doing what he wants to tell a story, the new showrunners were more concerned about emulating and adapting this story for a primarily American audience. That's not to say that all remakes are bad, but that Tomorrow Studios had their work cut out for them. Rather than rise to the occasion and create around 24 self-contained stories like the original, they decided to hire the guy who wrote Thor: The Dark World, and some good stuff too, to adapt it into a multi-season story with an overarching plot that would be more suitable for an American audience. The first, and only, season is just 10 episodes long, all of which are much longer than the originals, with some barely missing the hour mark. Having longer episodes would be a great way for some episodes to develop more and enrich the world building. Plus, with Netflix's lack of restrictions, episodes can be almost as long or as short as the creators want. This means the showrunners could make some episodes shorter than others to avoid unnecessary filler. However, when adapting Bebop into a more American drama setting and focusing on one main story, this causes a lot of issues. Firstly, the story they chose to tell. Even though the rivalry between Vicious and Spike was a core piece of the original, the few issues that exist with the show are largely due to this story. Vicious is chiefly important to Spike's character, but he is the textbook definition of a foil, a character who functionally serves to highlight certain aspects of another character. He's your average anime bad guy, complete with a generic anime look and attitude. He is only interesting because of how he relates to Spike. I wouldn't call Vicious a particularly strong villain, and he fades into indifference a lot of the time. I couldn't even remember his name after finishing Bebop for the first time, because he's not interesting. Luckily, this isn't really an issue with the anime because he's such a small focus in the grand scheme of things. Rather than being an incredibly deep character, he acts more like a force of nature than anything else. He's the main antagonist, but like I said before, most of the show doesn't involve itself with this larger narrative. However, when trying to adapt the original, the producers decided that it would be best to focus every single episode on Vicious and the main plot. They were clearly scared that the more character-driven and less crucial episodes of the show would not interest the Netflix audience unless it had more of a connective tie. They decided to make Vicious a main focus who takes up a lot of screen time. But because they also like money, they decided to try and split the show into seasons. The 10 episodes of the Netflix version take a huge chunk of time to tell the same story that the original tells in 5 much shorter episodes. It is 4.5 times longer. Each episode still has its own focus like the original, but they're all either directly related to Vicious or have a significant amount of time dedicated to his side of the plot. They compensate for this by adding other stories from the future of the original, or adapting concepts from the original to tell a new story. This is a horrible way to adapt source material like Bebop. It makes everything feel much less organic than it was in the anime, which was a main draw for the original. The world felt natural, lived in, and alive. It was musical and incredibly diverse. All of the characters could easily come from different places because the world is so vast and varied. Rather than being space cowboys wandering the solar system and getting into trouble like before, now they are all vessels for Spike to use in his attempts to taunt and dodge his past at every possible turn. Rather than feeling like a crew of main characters, it feels more like Spike and Friends, since the show is so drastically restructured to put him under a magnifying glass. Important character moments are practically tossed aside at times, and it doesn't give small things the room to breathe either. This completely undoes the original's greatest strengths. Similarly, the order in which these things happen makes no sense. In the original, Faye doesn't show up for a couple episodes while the show is mostly focusing on establishing Spike, Jet, and to a lesser extent, Ein. She comes in with a big introduction when she's ready, but initially she's entirely absent. Netflix, though, doesn't really like the idea of that, so they introduced Faye in episode 1. An adaptation of this story doesn't require her presence and was not about her. They shoehorn her in without a care, which wouldn't be so bad, but after her presence complicates the first episode, she completely vanishes for the next 2 episodes. Why? If she's already been introduced, keep her around. I get that these episodes didn't need her, but neither did the first one, so the creators obviously don't care. This may seem like a small issue, but it's indicative of why this show is a disaster. Because they're focused on telling a story that's been homogenized to be more like the cesspool that is American TV, it loses all soul. For example, the 8th episode is an adaptation of one of the most chilling and disturbing stories Cowboy Bebop has to offer. It revolves around a man who escapes from psychiatric care and acquires a ridiculous number of weapons to go on a massive murder spree. Spike happens to get caught in the crossfire and barely manages to survive. While doing some digging, the crew manages to find out the escapee has a disorder that makes his mind regress into that of a child. He loses all sense of morality and value for human life. But Spike finds a weakness and causes the man to freak out in a childish fit. He's an extremely intimidating villain because his mental deterioration causes him to kill without cause or mercy. He is simply doing it because he wants to, and nothing is stopping him. He doesn't choose Spike for any other reason than happenstance. It's genuinely chilling and shows that there's a lot more to play here than what we see. It's not some grand design, even though for us it's just another episode, it means something different to the characters. So, how does the Netflix version handle this intimidating villain? Simple. Vicious shows up to where he's being held captive, kills some people, and then releases the villain, telling him to kill Spike. It's connected to Vicious for no reason, which detracts from the killer's inherent scariness. Now he's just an assassin hired to kill Spike. That's significantly less interesting and detracts from the person we should be afraid of, while giving knockoff Sephiroth here some more screen time. This dude isn't nearly as scary, he's just another one of Vicious's henchmen. Also out of nowhere, it's revealed that the assassin can remote control Ein and use his eyes like projectors. That's not anything important to the point I'm trying to make, but it feels like a sin. It's also one of the only bits of actual character that Ein gets. He can turn into an RC car against his will. Wonderful. They don't do anything with it, and the remake removes all of Ein's intelligence. It's almost like it's a metaphor for the show as a whole. On top of the show ruining the overall narrative, as well as individual stories, the show also just has a really bad case of terrible pacing and structure. Like I said, it's 4.5 times longer than the part of the source material it decided to focus on. This show is crammed with so much filler that I'm surprised there's not a beach episode or a 3-part series about droids or something. It needlessly fills so much of its time with Vicious and Spike's past that it decides to rush things that could actually be important. Speaking of filler, Julia gets a much bigger role in this new version too. Unfortunately, none of it is interesting. In the original, it was discussed briefly, leaving the audience to imagine or infer events from the past. It encourages theorization and discussion, while still providing enough context for everything to make sense. In this version, however, it doesn't even matter to the characters very much. The original makes it clear that Spike is living day by day solely in the hope that he can reunite with her. She's quite literally his reason for breathing. In the remake, however, she's basically an afterthought to Spike. He's so focused on Vicious that he barely considers her. It's the worst of both sides. It's an inconsequential bore that doesn't raise the stakes for our main character. These reasons are clearly all issues of structure that could have been avoided by better understanding the source material. Changing the show this drastically caused it to form so many holes and cracks that the structure can't hold any water. The original was fast when it needed to be, but it could slow things down and let you really appreciate the world. It's all about living in the present. Not every single moment is integral to a character or major theme. Sometimes it tells a story just to tell a story. It's entertaining for the sake of being entertaining. But even in those moments, the characters learn and grow. They get better established, so the payoff is better at the end. The remake accomplishes none of these things. Even if you don't have the original to compare it to, you'd still have a muddled story with a boring antagonist and static characters. No one changes, barely anything happens, and the filler is really annoying. But that's just one of the show's many flaws. Switching to a less story-related topic, let's discuss the technical execution of the show. It sucks. But more than that, it buries any sense of style that was clearly thought about at one point. There are shots that look nice, choreography has its moments, and the show does an alright job of adapting certain parts of the original. But despite this, none of those positives are given much time to let you appreciate them. The direction for action sequences is horrendous and features all the worst bits of an action movie. It's jam-packed with quick cuts and a lack of focus, and the editing works in tandem to make them almost headache-inducing to watch. This was clearly a bit of overcompensation due to the switch in medium, as well as laziness or production issues. I heard people say that John Cho in particular looked really slow in the action, but I don't really think this is the case. The anime is really fast-paced in terms of its action because it can afford to be. Because it is animated, the characters can move faster than humans and it looks fine. It's already expecting you to suspend your disbelief by the very nature of being animated, so you're willing to accept a lot more unrealistic things. Slow action isn't a problem as long as the action is good. There are moments where the show is indeed pretty fun, but more often than not it's forced to adapt something from the original in a much less interesting way. This is a show about spaceships and highly skilled bounty hunters, but there's a shocking lack of space battles. The original was full of crazy space fights, giant lasers carving into Earth, explosions, and people getting trampled by horses. It's crazy to think you can adapt all this stuff in the same way, especially on a tight budget, which is why it should have been essential to put a unique spin on the action. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. Another positive is that the soundtrack is really good, for the most part. This is thanks to the return of the original composer, Yoko Kanno. But there are some weird moments, like this dramatic confrontation between two members of what is essentially the space mafia, and they start playing music that sounds like it would belong in a kabuki theater. Why? Because Japan? That's kinda weird. It's also insanely distracting and unintentionally hilarious. I imagine that was a decision made by someone other than the composer, but I don't know for sure. There's a few moments like this that feel odd, but ultimately it doesn't really detract from the best part of the remake. One thing that greatly suffered when it comes to the technical execution of the show is the tone. The writing, editing, and CGI all come together to produce a tone that can only be described as wannabe Marvel. It's a light, not very serious tone with constant one-liners and quips, as well as being full of action with no stakes, tension, or investment. In the original, characters get shot, stabbed, beat up, and trampled by horses, or thrown out windows. They recover from these wounds quickly, and they're usually not very serious, but they still visibly affect how a character moves and behaves. In this version, the characters feel somehow more cartoonish than the actual cartoon characters. They get flung around but end up being totally fine. The great thing about the anime is that the creator explicitly made the show to be 80% serious with about 20% comedy. The show slows down often to let the emotional weight of its events sink in, or to let the characters react organically. It loves ending on a melancholy note. But for here, it seems to be the opposite ratio. The show is 80% comedy with about 20% serious moments. This would be totally fine if it leaned into the wackier tone and allowed sillier things to happen, but it all feels surface level. The serious bits also fall flat, mostly due to the writing. They try to be all clever with twists, but they literally pull the same twist like 4 times and expect it to be a huge revelation each time. They establish this face-modifying tech as well as hologram tech, and both of these are used as fake-outs constantly. As it sits, it feels more like a misunderstanding of the original's tone and why the characters worked so well. This combined with the lackluster action is a major reason why the show failed to captivate me, but even so, it would be a minor point with some restructuring and focus on other issues. Despite all of the issues I've mentioned before, I think the biggest issue with the Cowboy Bebop 2021 remake is how it treats its own characters and themes. I've discussed it in part before, but now I think it's time to dive deep into the messages of the show, how they relate to our cast, and how that compares to what I said at the beginning. The biggest culprit of this blatant misunderstanding of the source material comes in the form of Vicious and Julia. In the original, they didn't have much going on in ways of character development or focus because they were almost entirely in Spike's memory and only mattered in how they related to Spike. In this one, however, they're forced to stand on their own legs because of how much screen time they have. I've already discussed Vicious a little bit, but let's take a look at specifically how his influence worsens everything. He spends a majority of his screen time talking about how cool and scary he is, forcing his way into Spike's life. He sends assassins and continually hunts him down, but the only thing he actually does is almost get shot by Spike. When he's not worried about Spike, he also takes over the Syndicate by being a really cool, smart, all-knowing being. See, he plans to take over the Syndicate by pretending he's captured and fighting the elders and guards with the help of his 2 new friends. Except he's really awesome and smart and cool, so he knows the people will betray him and only pretend to be caught. He's such a pathetic waste of an antagonist that he can't even participate in the climax properly. At the end of episode 5 in the original, Spike is hurled out a window during one of the most memorable moments of the show. If you have to split the show into seasons, it makes sense for this to be a finale. It's iconic and emotional. Except it's not Vicious that tosses him through a window in this version. It's Julia. That's right. Vicious is so pathetic that he gets usurped by Julia. All that time spent building up this intimidating villain is wasted because he doesn't do anything. He takes out the entire crime syndicate by being more omniscient than John Kramer, but does nothing else. Spike could have killed him, but actively chose not to at several points in the series. It's silly to pretend he's all-powerful and a super genius when we've already seen Spike aim a gun at his head and elect not to pull the trigger. In the original, Spike had to knowingly go on a suicide mission in order to take down Vicious and set things right. It accomplishes so much without actually spending much time talking about how smart he may be. But in this version, he's beyond pathetic. A complete waste of time. He sucked the lifeblood from other antagonists and Spike himself, but refuses to be even remotely interesting. But wait, there's a new villain in the final episode, so is she interesting at all? Let's analyze Julia to see if she fares any better. She allegedly starts off the same way she does in the original, being the thing that Spike can't let go of from his past. Her death at the end of the original is symbolic that in order to be truly free from your past, you have to move away from everything, including the good. Digging it back up will only lead to bad things. Vicious was the intimidating sense of death that comes from digging up your past, but Julia was the one thing that gave his life meaning, the obsession that convinced him it was worth reopening those wounds. Giving them more agency and character could have been cool, but it would have required real writing talent. Instead, let's give them both the most generic stories possible and call it a day. Episode 9 is a flashback that serves as nothing but filler, but it tries to give Julia and Vicious something to do. Julia is a lounge singer, and Vicious is a hot-headed son of a high-ranking member of organized crime. Julia basically does nothing but sing and hang out with Spike and Vicious. On the other hand, Vicious runs some dude over with a car and throws a temper tantrum. Spike cleans up after his mess, taking out the entire rival gang. Vicious tries to take credit but gets called out on Twitter.com.
You're an embarrassment, meaningless slug, whose only achievements come from the doings of others.
That's all the character we get for our two villains and an entire 60-minute episode dedicated to them. It's nothing but wasted time that didn't need to exist. But the worst part of it all is that they dare have the audacity to end things off with, "You're gonna carry that weight here." This was the final straw for me. They don't understand what this phrase means to the show, to its characters, and to its fans. They simply tossed it in because they knew it was a reference. As if what we just watched had a shred of the emotional significance the original use had. The only weight we have to carry is the realization that we just wasted an hour on these two blank characters and got nothing out of it. You could cut their involvement entirely except what little they were in the original, especially Julia, and the end result would be much better. In fact, their inclusion actively detracts from the crucially important bits of the show. As mentioned before, this balloon-looking dude is a one-off antagonist in the show who gets his character gutted by the remake. But he's not the only one who gets the dirty treatment from Netflix. Teddy Bomber makes an appearance early in the series. The original show's characters treat this guy like a total joke, instead focusing on the rivalry between Spike and a more exaggerated form of himself. This episode is largely used to characterize how bullheaded and prideful Spike can be, and how those flaws can detract from what actually matters. The teddy bear guy may get treated like a joke by the other characters, but the show itself still gives him time to shine. He gets to announce his manifesto at the very end, and could totally make for an interesting villain in a normal episode.
I only wanted to send out a warning against the needless waste created by capitalism without philosophy, the needless colonization of planets.
Well, Netflix decided to remove the rival bounty hunter, completely ruining the point of the episode, and gave the teddy bear guy his own episode. So, how do they treat him? Like even more of a joke than the original, of course. Now he's just some guy in his underwear who thinks explosions look cool. How wonderful. A villain can't stand on their own in case they accidentally become more interesting than this utter waste of space, so they reduce them all to total jokes or shells of their former selves. All of this complexity and fun is completely gone, leaving nothing behind. But the final thing I wanted to talk about is how all these things come together to absolutely desecrate the themes of the original. As mentioned before, Spike was a reckless cowboy who believes he's already dead. The tragedy of his character resides in the fact that despite being only 29, he acts like he has nothing to live for. He spends so long desperately clawing at the happiness of his past that he doesn't realize he has everything he already needs in the crew of Bebop. He's a partner changing the world for the better, which is what Jet needs. He's a voice of reason for Faye, anchoring her to something substantial in the present. He's in many ways like a father figure or big brother for Ed. All of these relationships are more than enough reasons for Spike to keep living. He doesn't realize it, but he needs them as much as they need him. What does the remake say about this? The only relationship that's kept remotely intact is Spike's relationship with Jet. They still act like partners in crime and justice together, but the final episode tosses that out the window too. Spike and Faye have a couple friendly scenes together, but overall act more like distrusting coworkers, which is totally a thing in the original, but their relationship evolves beyond that towards the end. The only scene with Ed is at the very end and serves for a teaser for the second season, so that's out too. At the point of the finale, what does Spike have to live for? He has no partner, nobody to turn to, only the weight of his past to carry. The message is completely lost. Spike's obsession with Vicious led nowhere, only for him to be tossed out a window by Julia, who, remember, is basically an afterthought to Spike. The moral of the story here is almost that you should learn to let go of your past, but that gets muddled too. There's a part where Spike finds out that the Syndicate is involved with one of their bounties, so he immediately wants out.
You're the one who's always saying that we gotta live by rules, and the rule is when it comes to the Syndicate, we walk away. Right?
However, he's forced into it against his will. This causes Vicious to find out his old partner is still alive, and begin a massive manhunt for him. Vicious is obsessed with finding and killing Spike, and does literally everything in his very lame and limited power to find him. That's the whole point of the show. In the original, Spike walks into his own fate. He refuses to listen to his friends and pays the price. But in the remake, the entire Syndicate is hunting him down. His past is chasing him, not the other way around. He didn't want this, so him dealing with it feels less impactful. So is the message that Spike can't outrun his past no matter how hard he tries? That the things he did will catch up to him? Well, maybe, but that's not fully developed either. Despite being a much less interesting message, Spike also stopped trying to run from it. Julia clearly had every intention of taking over the Syndicate and kidnapping Vicious whether or not Spike was there. She just wanted Spike to be there for dramatic effect and also so she can do the classic
"And together you and I can rule the galaxy"
shtick. Spike's involvement doesn't matter, so what did Spike do to make him deserve losing everything and being tossed out a window? What is his fatal flaw? What weight does he have to carry? Julia seems to think that it's because he never came to see her.
All these years, you knew where I was. Yet you let me languish with him.
It feels like the showrunners read a summary of about 15 episodes, put fragments of said episodes into a blender, and then just went with it. Netflix should be ashamed of this whole project. The creators completely refused to stick to the original masterpiece's story, completely ignoring its strengths and instead putting a giant neon sign directing your attention to its flaws. Everything they added made the show worse. They were clearly more interested in making a mafia version of a Marvel movie than anything else. At the end of the day, this absolute insult doesn't tarnish the original, but I shudder to think that potentially millions of people are seeing this as their first, and probably only, exposure to Cowboy Bebop. Now that the series has been cancelled, I hope that fans of the live action will seek out the original. This series was named after a form of jazz that perfectly encapsulates the show's free-flowing style. It breaks conventions and isn't afraid to try something new. The original creator said that it was an entirely new genre, and to an extent he's right. This lack of overall structure and free spirit is the show's greatest strength. The world is rich, diverse, and soulful. The nature is integral to its character. But what Netflix has tried to do is capture that free spirit and torture it. It can no longer be original and try something new. The jazz spirit is gone. They've taken the bebop out of Cowboy Bebop. There's nothing left here but a bad plot and stereotypical characters. They took something beautiful and tried to appeal to the lowest common denominator, rather than welcoming the viewers to something wholly unique. It may look like bebop, but it sure doesn't sound like it, nor does it feel like it. Instead of introducing a primarily American audience to a new perspective, it forced the new perspective to shift itself into something it's not. That's not to say it dumbed itself down or anything, but it ended up losing everything in translation. There are good things, and it's unfair to compare it to one of my favorite pieces of media in history, but it pains me to see such a missed opportunity. I don't think this should have been a shot-for-shot remake, to be clear. A remake should change things. I'm not attacking this show because it made changes. I'm attacking it because the changes were a missed opportunity, and almost every single one was for the worse. Now that I've finished watching this literal travesty, I'm gonna have to carry that weight for a long time. This isn't the kind of video I normally make, but I hope you enjoyed it anyway. If you made it this far into the video, tell me, you like jazz? And I'll heart your comment. Thanks for watching.